Well, hello and welcome to our latest edition of Weather or Not. I'm Meteorologist Brian Karstens, and thank you for joining us. I am solo today. Scott has the day off, and we wish him well after a busy week. And of course, we've been covering a lot of subjects this week in weather. Obviously, the severe weather has been a big part of that conversation, and thankfully, at least to end the week, I think that story is less, but unfortunately, it's not gone entirely. And we're going to be kicking things off here today, talking a little bit more about the weather forecast as we get an upfront look at the weather here this afternoon. We've been following the risk of some severe weather in western South Dakota. And that's where we want to begin here as we track those latest developments. Of course, you can check out more information online throughout the rest of the day today. But just to give you some ideas of what we've been tracking, we have new development here in northwestern South Dakota. And you can see that southeasterly wind feeding into some of those showers and thunderstorms. And unfortunately, it looks like the mode of severe weather, we're going to go back to some scattered supercells. That terminology we've been throwing around this week with these individual very large and at times very destructive storms. Now, I will say this. Today's weather, we don't have as much instability as we had earlier in the week. So while there will likely be at least some severe weather here, we're hopeful that we're not tracking the amount of storms or the severity or the organization of that being as widespread. But still, we have to be mindful of where these storms are roaming this evening. There will likely be some large hail and also the potential for those other attendant threats of severe weather, some damaging winds, and also an isolated tornado. But look how it weakens overnight, and that's the big story. We are going to see a big weakening trend as that moves east, and we're not concerned about severe weather in eastern KELOLAND. The atmosphere looks to be fairly stable at this point. So that's kind of the summation of the here and now here as we go out throughout the afternoon. What's next? Well, we're going to be looking at the big picture as we get into next week. And, of course, more details and recap of this week's severe weather when we continue with this latest edition of Weather or Not. Stay with us. Welcome back to this edition of Weather or Not. I'm meteorologist Brian Karstens. Well, this week we have been covering a lot of storm damage across the region. Obviously, with these extremely strong and violent winds, it has left a permanent scar on some of the landscape here across southern KELOLAND. And one community hit especially hard is the community of Hudson. And, of course, we've covered several stories there, but one piece of information came to my attention this morning, and I wanted to bring up a couple of pictures and some very telling information, if you will, about this storm. So this is taking you into Google Maps into the town of Hudson. Now, in the town itself, a lot of damage. And, of course, we have talked about the acreages and the farms that surround Hudson as well, this whole region of southern Lincoln into western Sioux County. But one farmstead in particular that got our attention this morning is the Solberg Farm. Now, this is a pretty well-known marker on the roadways. If you're in the Hudson area, you know where this is. And on the Google street level mapping, I wanted to give you kind of the bird's eye view from the before, and then maybe this will also tell us more about the story as we go through the after picture. So let me go down the road. Again, this is about a mile to the east of Hudson. And, of course, you can see this red barn here, clearly labeled. A lot of folks know this very well. This is a century farm, a lot of history. And I grew up on a farm, and as I heard this story, and as we're going to show you in a moment, some of the pictures and the barn and all the rest and all the things that get talked about, it is a very big impact. And I know that for those in that area, know that place well. And this is just a picture of some of the aftermath of this storm. And these words only start to describe what we're looking at here. You can see the debris. This is, again, looking in a three-dimensional landscape, which when we saw this coming in this morning, this is storytelling like I have not done before, but I know that this is technology that's used in a lot of different venues. Obviously, doing it in a storm damage scenario is a different one, but looking at what it can do. Storms with 100 plus mile-an-hour winds. The devastation here and all the history into these farm buildings, it's very hard to describe. These pictures, though, I think for us looking at this as viewers, just tells us the scope of all of this. Look at this damage, all of this debris that is strewn out. You've got just big pieces of metal and chunks of the barn moved out, and this, of course, goes all the way across this farmstead. Numerous barn granary involved here, too. I don't have all of the details right in front of me, but obviously these pictures tell our viewers a lot about what has happened here. And this is just one example of so many in this area of southeastern South Dakota. This was the hardest hit area. I will say that as you look at the damage here, you can see the primary driver of the wind, obviously uprooting trees. A lot of this is straight line wind, obviously, but when you're dealing with 100 mile an hour winds or more, again, I would probably estimate in the Hudson area, we're at least in that category. This is all tornado damage, tornado-like damage when it has that much power. This is definitely extremely strong wind. And again, just some pictures just to share with you on this Friday. We thank the Solberg family for sharing this with us. I know that this has been a very hard week to see this kind of damage. And again, our hearts are with those folks and prayers as well as we continue to clean up and those that are affected by these storms. It's been a long week. So take some breaks as you clean up, pace yourself, and obviously getting into the next week. The last thing people want to hear about is the chance of more storms. But we are going to share more details on the forecast and the possibility of that when we continue on Whether or Not. Stay with us. Welcome back to this latest edition of Whether or Not. I'm meteorologist Brian Karstens, and we're here to tell you about the subjects we're covering in weather as we wrap up the week. And one story that has popped up again, unfortunately, is this whole conversation about smoke in the air from these Canadian wildfires. And, throughout the broadcast the last 24 hours, we've been showing a lot of our live cams with a tremendous amount of haze, and you can smell it again in the air, and it's a big story for those that are affected by that. I know that is a subject that for some of you, you're very sensitive to those particulates in the atmosphere. A lot of that is being driven by Canadian air that is sinking south, and that's setting the tone for the nice cooler weather that we're getting, but just because of the origination of all these fires to the north. Here's a map that's of interest here for some of you kind of watching the larger perspective, and you can see that obviously we have a lot of those gray colors indicating the smoke, and when you get areas of high pressure from Canada, this is a classic setup, again, to support these areas of smoke, and it traps those particles in the lower part of the atmosphere especially, and once we get into a cycle like this, it just gets to be pretty tough to push out of that. And so we've got to deal with that subject today and getting into your weekend. I still think that is going to be around in our forecast. And obviously there you can see the coloring representing that smoke. And you'll actually see that it's moving in from the east. So it's getting entrained around that area of high pressure. And then it comes back from Iowa and Minnesota back into South Dakota. So that's kind of the story headline there. So we're basically just going to have to wait this out as this smoke will likely continue to cause some problems. And I expect next week that will improve once we start to change the weather pattern, which, of course, then the trade-off is going to be the increasing heat and the increasing humidity. And on that note, that's another subject we're going to pick up and talk more about in just a few minutes. So stay with us. Welcome back to this edition of Whether or Not. I'm meteorologist Brian Karstens. So in this segment, I want to talk about the extended forecast and some of the important developing trends that we are monitoring for the upcoming week. And there are some big stories that I think we need to address. So first of all, we're going to start with our temperature anomaly forecast. So basically, this gives us kind of an idea across the country where temperatures are running either above normal or below normal for this time of the year. And for August 1st, we're starting to go down the temperature scale. We've crested. We always do that about a month after the summer solstice. And now temperatures tend to cool in August, which typically brings in better chances of rain when you look at the forecast climatologically speaking. Now, of course, every year is different. This July was exceptionally wet in some cases. We'll see if August continues that pattern. But I can tell you, as long as it stays cooler than average and we have some battling going on with the air masses, we are going to generate more thunderstorm chances. We're going to start early next week, still below average. Our 7-day forecast keeps Sioux Falls in the 70s, at least through Monday or Tuesday. But then after that, you can see that we tend to change course here a little bit. And we end the month, or end the week, I should say, above average. And there's actually quite a bit of humidity that's going to go into that forecast. And that's the first or the next thing I want to address here as we bring up our dew point forecast. So this looks at, of course, dew point being the measure of moisture in this map. It's the lower part of the atmosphere. We're just looking at the surface dew points. So you know by now the drill here. If we talk dew points in the 70s or near 80, that's extremely tropical. Dew points in the 50s, you can handle that. That's a lot drier. We're feeling that here today and going into the weekend as well. You can see dew points on Saturday, still in the 50s across our eastern counties. Now, you notice in western South Dakota, those numbers jump back up again. They're in the 60s. We've got a predominant southeasterly wind in the forecast, and we are anticipating that southeast wind will slowly but surely increase the amount of humidity that we're dealing with. These dew point numbers are, on average, going to be going up into Tuesday and Wednesday of next week, and I have to tell you that this is going to be part of the conversation surrounding these chances of storms, because once we set the foundation for higher humidity and warmer temperatures, the instability forecast is going to go right back up again as we get into those days. Now, but the particulars about how each day is handled, that's obviously a question that we're not going to be able to address all those details just yet. But here's another map to look at. This is our instability outlook. So for looking at the amount of fuel for these storms to tap into, the best ribbon of moisture and instability is western South Dakota to finish up our week. We can see that again showing up tomorrow. So that's why some of these severe weather outlooks continue to highlight these areas of western South Dakota, not so much in the east. And that's a very important thing we need to continue to harp on. Even though there might be some thunderstorms coming through, we expect some rain chances to grow on Sunday. The amount of instability is still higher in central and western South Dakota. So we'll evaluate that. If that changes, obviously, stay plugged in on the weekend forecast. But I would anticipate right now the Sioux Falls area will still be kind of in that lower end scale when it comes to moisture, or at least the energy level for those storms. Now, next week, that's not going to be the case anymore. Once we kick this out to Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, just about every day here, the European model is painting some pretty decent amounts of instability. In fact, I have to be honest with you, once we kick this out to next Thursday or Friday, those numbers are pretty high. Okay, so we're going to have to resolve that as we get into the forecast. And if it weren't for the fact that the jet stream is also a concern to us, it's one thing to talk about heat and humidity, because sometimes this time of year you can stay capped, and then that will tend to limit the amount of storms that we see. But in this case, we're probably not there yet, because that big heat dome is still more dominant to our south. So it appears to me that as we kick off the weather forecast for the early part of the week, we're going to have cascading areas of showers and thunderstorms coming in from the northwest. Not all of those are severe, but they're definitely present. And that makes a lot of sense when you look at how things are stacked in the upper part of the atmosphere. We tend to be on what's called the ring of fires. You watch the outer edges of that high-pressure center that's parked over New Mexico. Keep in mind, this is a model forecast, so the exact placement of these features is subject to change, but it's important if we start looking to the northwest of KELOLAND, once we kick this out here toward Wednesday and Thursday. There's a in fact, not just one, but at least a couple of different areas of low pressure up here in Canada. And if you funnel those westerly winds across the Rockies and into the plains and override that heat and humidity that's at the surface, you're really setting up a pattern here that's going to be conducive for some clusters of severe weather. That is probably the most generic statement I can bring you on a Friday going into next week. But I want to give you a heads up that the pattern tends to breed storm complexes across the northern plains, and this can run anywhere from middle of next week, might not be every day, I sure hope it's not, but the pattern is definitely there at times until we get another kicker cold front that'll come out of the northwest at some point. I would imagine that would be tied to that low-pressure center spinning up there in Saskatchewan. Eventually, once we figure out the timing on that, there should be a pretty strong front again that'll come through, and that would be my concern, would be, some more severe weather with such a strong low like that up there in the prairies of Canada. That's pretty significant, and it tends to really amp up our mid-level jet stream winds across the northern plains. And obviously, there is kind of a laundry list of things that we look at when we forecast what we call these MCSs, or these mesoscale convective systems, and on a broader scale, too. I mean, these bigger windstorms that we've seen in the plains. It is a time of year that can breed this. Obviously, I don't need to tell you that. You know where we've been the past week. So, again, just getting a little conversation going about that subject. Obviously, we're going to be here to track anything that changes, and we can hope that pattern breaks more than the modeling is showing now. But if the modeling continues to show this, I will say that it is looking pretty favorable for some storms in our region. So again, keep a watchful eye on that. Okay, well, that's our discussion there. We'll have more details and our last segment here on Whether or Not coming up. Stay with us. Welcome back, folks. Well, that's going to put a wrap on today's program. We thank you for watching Whether or Not as we continue to look at the stories affecting weather in KELOLAND. I'm sure we're going to have a lot more to talk about with next week's program. Scott will be back with me as well as we begin again on Monday. All right, well, that's the very latest. We encourage you to take care this weekend as you're out and about. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.